You'll hear unspecific and fluffy information about starting a podcast, but today I'm going to be honest about how exactly to start a podcast from scratch. I won't hold back and I'll tell you how I started a podcast almost for free. I've literally gone onto Google and typed in how to start a podcast, and it's come up with lots of different questions, frequently asked questions that people ask about starting a podcast that people aren't sure about. And I'm literally going to answer them now. So, how do you start a podcast with no experience? So, when I first started my podcast, which was called Help I'm a Freelancer, with my friend, we actually went to a free course in our local area, which told us exactly how to start a podcast from scratch. So, we didn't have any experience and we just learned how to do it. Starting a podcast from scratch can seem very, very daunting. It certainly was to me, but it's completely feasible. The first thing you need to do is not worry about all the equipment that you might use. You can worry about that later. The first thing you need to do is figure out, what are you going to talk about on your podcast? What is going to be your niche? And the way that you do that is you go and do a little bit of research. You go onto Spotify, you go onto Apple Podcasts, and you literally type in your niche area. So when I started out a few years ago, I typed in freelancing podcasts. So it came up with lots of different freelancing podcasts that were out there. And that really helped me and my friend, my co-host, figure out exactly what we were trying to do. Now, fast forward 2 years, I have recently, just a few months ago, started a new podcast, which is a law podcast. So if you don't know me, my background is law, and I wanted to create a podcast that stood out in the legal industry because I noticed that there wasn't any good, interesting law podcasts out there. So what I did was I went straight to Spotify and I started doing some research. I came up with a spreadsheet. You don't have to do this, by the way. This is just in-depth research that I wanted to do. And I came up with all the legal podcasts that were out there and figured out what made them good or bad. So I started listening to them, and I got about 1 or 2 minutes into each episode, and I was just like, I don't even want to continue listening because it's that boring. So I wanted to make one that stood out. So the first thing you need to do is figure out your niche and how you can stand out in the industry. To be honest with you, when I first started podcasting, I found it very difficult to find information. I went onto YouTube and tried to figure out what on earth I could do. Obviously, I did this free course, but I wanted more information and I couldn't really find that much information, which is one of the reasons why I decided to make this video. So, the next thing you need to do when you're starting a podcast from scratch, when you don't have any experience at all, is to just look at your device that you have. So, if you want to record a podcast remotely, let's say you want to interview guests, then I would suggest using software like Riverside, Zencaster, because they are both specifically used for podcasts and they are remote recording software, which are really, really good. I personally prefer Riverside because the quality is better, but you can also use other things. Now, I would suggest really making sure that you choose the right quality software to begin with, because quality is everything in podcasting. It's literally everything. I can start listening to a podcast and I will stop listening if the quality is bad. And because there's so many podcasts out there, people are picky about the ones that they choose. So I would suggest making sure that you choose the best quality system. Now, what I personally recommend from my experience is using Riverside for remote recording and using Audacity for in person recording. Both are free. I personally pay for Riverside because I record so many podcast episodes now. I have a podcast business where I record for my clients. So I am recording podcasts almost every single day. So I need the extra time. But if you're someone who wants to record a few episodes per month, maybe even one per week, or even two per week, you'll pretty much be okay with the free plan. But if you want to do Audacity, you can record unlimited on there. Another thing is if you've got an Apple computer and Mac, then you can use GarageBand. I've not used it because I don't have Apple, but I've heard that it's very, very good. The next thing you need to worry about is a microphone. So I would suggest investing in a goodish microphone. When I started out, as I mentioned in the beginning, we almost started for free. We used free equipment, free software, but we did pay for a microphone. But we paid about £20, which is the equivalent of about $30 maybe, maybe a little bit more. But that's the only thing we bought, to be honest with you. And you could even use cheaper versions. I've been online recently and I have recently bought a small microphone that I can carry around and record podcasts on the go when I travel, and that was only £13, which is probably equates to about $20. So you can keep it to a minimum and still have good quality. As you progress, you may want to invest in better equipment, but in the beginning, you don't really need to worry. And you know what? I have recorded podcasts with guests who don't have a microphone, and they just use the microphone that's installed in their Apple computer, laptop, Mac, and it is as good as a microphone in many, many cases. If you have an Apple computer, then the quality is very, very good actually. But I wouldn't recommend recording on any other laptop because the microphone isn't usually as good. So how much does it cost to start a podcast? So as I've mentioned, you can pay quite a small amount towards a microphone. And I would say if you're going to pay for anything, pay for a microphone. Unless you have an Apple equipment, which I think is just incredible, honestly. But you'll probably find that you have equipment around. So you could even record on AirPods and things like these. Check out the quality, just have a play around with it, and you'll be able to notice what quality is better than others. You don't want the sound to be tinny, you don't want it to be echoey, and you just want it to be just very, very smooth and a lovely sounding audio. What I would suggest is recording in a room where it isn't a really big room and where it doesn't echo. And I would also suggest, if possible, if you're doing solo episodes, you could even record in a cupboard or under a duvet, or make sure it's very cushioned and soft, and make sure the sound cannot travel. So what I mean by that is if you're sitting in a really big room, the sound can travel and then the audio is more likely to be echoey. So make sure you're in an area where the sound can't travel, like under a duvet. So as I mentioned, you pretty much can start a podcast for free. You can set it up for free. You can use free software, which I've already mentioned, and you can set up for free on Spotify. So Spotify is a really good platform to start a podcast on. You can also use other platforms like Acast, which is also free, where you can get really good statistics from it, and you can it basically disperses your podcast onto all other podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon. It's really quite good. I'm actually trying it out at the moment, so I will give a review on that. I started on Spotify, which used to be called Anchor, and to be honest with you, it's really, really good in the beginning, especially if you just want to get started. It's free to set up. It's very, very simple. All you have to do is just literally upload the episodes and it'll bring in statistics and let you know how your episodes are doing. It's a good starting point. But if you want to be serious about podcasting, then it's a good idea to move to another platform like Buzzsprout or Podbean or Acast, where you're able to get more accurate statistics, which means you're able to get sponsors and monetize and things like that. You can still monetize through Spotify, but it's potentially not as good. I'm actually in the process of weighing up the different options and seeing what is good for new podcasters. So watch this space. Do podcasts make money? I'm going to do a whole episode about this, but in short, yes. So depending on why you have the podcast, perhaps you have a business, a service, you're selling a product. A podcast is a perfect marketing tool to be able to do this. There are also other ways to monetize a podcast. You can get sponsors, you can set up subscription episodes, you could create a community, you could sell digital products. There are so many different ways that you can monetize a podcast. I will go into this in more detail in another episode, but I could literally just come up with 10 different ways off the top of my head, like right now. Shall we do it? Okay, so sponsors, having a paid newsletter, creating affiliate marketing, digital products, services, set up a Patreon where people donate money to you, create a paid community, create a course, put ads in there, generate money from YouTube if you put the podcast on YouTube as a video as well. Is it hard to start a podcast? No. To be honest, it's not hard. It's not rocket science. It really isn't. You just need to know a little bit of information about how to record a good quality podcast, what you need to put in place, so the equipment, the software, which again isn't that technical, even for people who aren't technical. You also just need a niche, so a really good idea. And if you're going to have guests, then you need to speak to people, get guests on your podcast. So starting out isn't that difficult. The difficult part is being and staying consistent with producing your episodes. So it takes a lot of time. And with podcasting, you either put into it time or money. So if you can't afford to pay someone to edit your episodes, or to put a strategy in place, or to help you work out how to launch the podcast, then you've got to put time into that. You've got to learn how to launch a podcast. You've got to learn how to edit. And you've got to learn how to be strategic about monetizing a podcast. So it takes a lot of time. It's not difficult, but it takes up time, effort, energy. And these are all things that a lot of people just don't have. How long should your podcast episodes be? Well, I would say, and I've looked at statistics about this from Riverside as well, which says that the sweet spot is around 20 to 30 minutes for a podcast episode. If you're doing solo episodes, then it could be a little bit shorter. But again, it really, really depends on your niche area and your type of podcast. So if you are running a podcast where you're interviewing people, then you might want to have longer episodes. And I would say 25 to 30 minutes would be a good amount of time. And if you're doing solo episodes, 15 to 20 minutes. What should you talk about in your first podcast episode? So again, depends on your niche, depends on what you're trying to achieve. But I would say that you should start off with an idea of what you want your podcast to achieve. Let's say you want to sell a product or a service, then I would talk about something that is a pain point for that. So I'll explain this. Let's say you're selling a copywriting course, then your first episode should be about how to start writing. And in that, you can talk about the pain points of people don't know how to properly sell through writing. And it's one of the best skills that you could possibly learn in order to increase your income and transform your business. In saying this, I have a product which will help you do this and help you learn about it. So you could talk about the benefits of copywriting and stuff like that. That could be something, but I would say focus on something that either educates, inspires, or entertains people. when you're thinking about what to talk about in your first episode, you want to capture attention, you want to really attract attention, and you want it to be a really outstanding episode. So when I've started my second podcast, my law podcast, it's all about how to be a lawyer in a different way. So how to be more than a lawyer. Perhaps it's becoming a digital nomad lawyer. Perhaps it's getting out of the traditional working life. And so my first episode was with a digital nomad lawyer who was practicing and traveling, and we spoke about all these different topics. And this was like completely on brand for the podcast. You know, I wanted to talk about being free, being able to be a digital nomad, doing things your way, creating your own life. This was perfect, a perfect starting episode. And I made sure the questions were different, they weren't boring, and that people would be hooked and interested. So you need to think about these sorts of aspects when you're thinking about your first episode. How many listeners does a podcast need to be successful? This is very much dependent on your niche. You know, sponsor you without you having any listeners at all. If they know that your listeners, your future prospective listeners, your target audience is going to be perfect for their brand. I know somebody who started a podcast without having any listeners, and they were able to monetize the podcast straight away because they told their sponsors that their guests would be huge business people which may be interested in their product. So it actually doesn't matter how many listeners you have. Obviously, if you have a lot of listeners, then that's better because you've got more people, more attention, and you know, by far incredible, and you're able to monetize in so many different ways. So the more the better, obviously. But that doesn't mean you can't monetize a podcast if you have, you know, just a handful of listeners. If the quality of your listeners is very, very good, then brands would sponsor, and you may also be able to sell your products and services depending on who the audience is and why they're listening. It's not about the quantity of the audience, it's about the quality of the audience. If you want to know more about podcasting, then I would highly recommend subscribing to this channel because I'm going to be giving all my secret tips about podcasting. I am learning on the way, and I am sharing my journey of how I am progressing and going through this industry, this podcasting industry, which is always developing and growing. So if you want to start a podcast and you want to build authority and lead the way, recommend following this content. And I'm going to be dropping a few more episodes in this series about starting a podcast from scratch. Another thing is, I actually have a free email course which helps you start a podcast from scratch. It is a 5-day email course where you receive an email each day guiding you through the process of starting a podcast, and it should equip you to start a podcast. It's literally all the information that I had and more when I first started my first podcast. I will put that in the description.